Hi, alchemists. Welcome back. My name is Ava, aka Queen Midas Life Alchemist, and I am back for another episode of The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. This is by Bessel Van Der Kolk, MD. This is week 10 that we're going on. So if you are just joining, hello and welcome. You are probably going to want to go to week 1 because I am reading through this book and we're already halfway through. So I would highly suggest stopping this and starting from the beginning. And there's a lot of great information. So yeah. Oh, I'm like this sliding away from my table. So you will find all my information in the description box below, booking information, and also my donation links and my email if you'd like to get in touch with me. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Okay, so we are picking up on page 176. This section is called Uncovering the Secrets of Trauma. In the late 19th century, when medicine first began the systematic study of mental problems, the nature of traumatic memory was one of the central topics under discussion. In France and England, a prodigious number of articles were published on a syndrome known as railway spine, a psychological aftermath of railroad accidents that included loss of memory. The greatest advances, however, came in the study of hysteria, a mental disorder characterized by emotional outbursts, susceptibility to suggestion, and contractions and paralysis of the muscles that could not be explained by simple anatomy. Once considered an affliction of unstable or malingering women, the name comes from the Greek word for womb. Hysteria now became a window into the mysteries of mind and body. The names of some of the greatest pioneers in neurology and psychiatry, such as Jean-Martin Charcot, Pierre Janet, and Sigmund Freud, are associated with the discovery that trauma is at the root of hysteria, particularly the trauma of childhood sexual abuse. These early researchers referred to traumatic memories as pathogenic secrets or mental parasites, because as much as the sufferers wanted to forget whatever had happened, their memories kept forcing themselves into consciousness, trapping them in ever-renewing present of existential horror. The interest in hysteria was particularly strong in France, and as so often happens, its roots lay in the politics of the day. Jean-Martin Charcot, who is widely regarded as the father of neurology, and whose pupils, such as Gilles de la Tour, lent their names to numerous neurological diseases, was also active in politics. Okay, that guy whose name I just said before, his last name totally looks like Tourette, like from Tourette syndrome, but I really feel like that's the Americanized way of saying it. But I'm just going to say Tourette because I feel like it's going to end up being Tourette syndrome. Anyway, okay, that's a total side note. After Emperor Napoleon III abdicated in 1870, there was a struggle between the monarchists, the old order backed by the clergy, and the advocates of the fledgling French Republic, who believed in science and in secular democracy. Charcot believed that women would be a critical factor in the struggle, and his investigation of hysteria offered a scientific explanation for phenomena such as demonic possession states, witchcraft, exorcism, and religious ecstasy. Charcot conducted meticulous studies of the physiological and neurological correlates of hysteria in both men and women, all of which emphasized embodied memory and a lack of language. For example, in 1889, he published the case of a patient named Lelog, who developed paralysis of the legs after being involved in a traffic accident with a horse-drawn cart. Although Lelog fell to the ground and lost consciousness, his legs appeared unhurt, and there were no neurological signs that would indicate a physical cause for his paralysis. Charcot discovered that just before Lelog passed out, he saw the wheels of the cart approaching him and strongly believed that he would be run over. He noted that the patient does not preserve any recollection. Questions addressed to him upon this point are attended with no result. He knows nothing or almost nothing. Like many other patients, at the, oh man, Salpêtrière. I really apologize if there's French people watching because I don't speak French. Lelog expressed his experience physically. Instead of remembering the accident, he developed paralysis of his legs. Interesting. But for me, the real hero of the story is Pierre Genet, who helped Charcot establish a research laboratory devoted to the study of hysteria at the Salpêtrière. In 1889, the same year that the Eiffel Tower was built, Genet published the first book-length scientific account of traumatic stress. Oh my gosh, what is this word? Okay. L'automatisme psychologique. Y'all, hang in there with me. Genet proposed that at the root of what we now call PTSD was the experience of vehement emotions or intense emotional arousal. The treatise explained that after having been traumatized, people automatically keep repeating certain actions, emotions, and sensations related to the trauma. And unlike Charcot, who was primarily interested in measuring and documenting patients' physical symptoms, Genet spent untold hours talking with them, trying to discover what was going on in their minds. Also, in contrast to Charcot, whose research focused on understanding the phenomena of hysteria, Genet was first and foremost a clinician whose goal was to treat his patients. That is why I studied his patients. That is why I studied his case reports in detail and why he became one of my most important teachers. So here's a picture on the page 178 of Jean-Martin Charcot presents the case of a patient with hysteria. Charcot transformed La Salpêtrière, an ancient asylum for the poor of Paris, which he transformed into a modern hospital. Notice the patient's dramatic posture. Okay, so here is, y'all excuse my creaky chair. Okay, so here is that picture here, and you see he's holding this woman who's in this dramatic pose there. Okay, moving on. So we are in a new section on 179, amnesia, dissociation, and reenactment. Genet was the first to point out the difference between narrative memory, the stories people tell about trauma, and the traumatic memory itself. One of his case histories was the first of Irene, a young woman who was hospitalized following her mother's death from tuberculosis. Irene had nursed her mother for many months while continuing to work outside the home to support her alcoholic father and pay for her mother's medical care. When her mother finally died, Irene, exhausted from stress and lack of sleep, tried for several hours to revive the corpse, calling out to her mother and trying to force medicine down her throat. At one point, the lifeless body dropped off the bed while Irene's drunken father lay passed out nearby. Even after an aunt arrived and started preparing for the burial, Irene's denial persisted. She had to be persuaded to attend the funeral, and she laughed throughout the service. A few weeks later, she was brought to the Salpêtrière, where Genet took over her case. In addition to amnesia for her mother's death, Irene suffered from another symptom. Several times a week, she would stare trance-like at an empty bed, ignore whatever was going on around her, and begin to care for an imaginary person. She meticulously reproduced rather than remembered the details of her mother's death. Traumatized people simultaneously remember too much and too little. On one hand, Irene had no conscious memory of her mother's death. She could not tell the story of what had happened. On the other, she was compelled to physically act out the events of her mother's death. Genet's term, automatism, conveys the involuntary, unconscious nature of her actions. Genet treated Irene for several months, mainly with hypnosis. At the end, he asked her again about her mother's death. Irene started to cry and said, "Don't remind me of those terrible things. My mother was dead, and my father was a complete drunk, as always. I had to take care of her dead body all night long. I did a lot of silly things in order to revive her. In the morning, I lost my mind. Not only was Irene able to tell the story, but she had also recovered her emotions. I feel very sad and abandoned. Janae now called her memory complete because it now was accompanied by the appropriate feelings. Janae noted significant differences between ordinary and traumatic memory. Traumatic memories are precipitated by specific triggers. In Julian's case, the trigger was his girlfriend's seductive comments. In Irene's, it was a bed. When one element of a traumatic experience is triggered, other elements are likely to automatically follow. Traumatic memory is not condensed. It took Irene 3 to 4 hours to reenact her story, but when she was finally able to tell what had happened, it took less than a minute. The traumatic enactment serves no function. In contrast, ordinary memory is adaptive. Our stories are flexible and can be modified to fit the circumstances. Ordinary memory is essentially social. It's a story that we tell for a purpose. In Irene's case, to enlist her doctor's help and comfort. In Julian's case, to recruit me to join his search for justice and revenge. But there is nothing social about traumatic memory. Julian's rage at his girlfriend's remarks serve no useful purpose. Reenactments are frozen in time, unchanging, and they are always lonely, humiliating, and alienating experiences. Janae coined the term dissociation to describe the splitting off and isolation of memory imprints that he saw in his patients. He was also prescient about the heavy cost of keeping these traumatic memories at bay. He later wrote that when patients dissociate their traumatic experience, they become attached to an insurmountable obstacle. Unable to integrate their traumatic memories, they seem to lose their capacity to assimilate new experiences as well. It is as if their personality has definitely stopped at a certain point and cannot enlarge any more by the addition or assimilation of new elements. He predicted that unless they become aware of the split-off elements and integrated them into a story that had happened in the past but was now over, they would experience a slow decline in their personal and professional functioning. This phenomenon has now been well documented in contemporary research. Janae discovered that while it is normal to change and distort one's memories, people with PTSD are unable to put the actual event, the source of the memories, behind them. Dissociation prevents the trauma from becoming integrated within the conglomerated, ever-shifting stores of autobiographical memory, in essence, creating a dual memory system. Normal memory integrates the elements of each experience into the continuous flow of self-experience by a complex process of association. Think of a dense but flexible network where each element exerts a subtle influence on many others. But in Julian's case, the sensations, thoughts, and emotions of the trauma were stored separately as frozen, barely comprehensible fragments. If the problem with PTSD is dissociation, the goal of treatment would be association, integrating the cutoff elements of the trauma into the ongoing narrative of life so that the brain can recognize that that was then and this is now. We are on the next section called The Origins of the Talking Cure. Psychoanalysis was born on the wards of the Salpêtrière. In 1885, Freud went to Paris to talk with Charcot, and he later named his firstborn son, Jean-Martin, in Charcot's honor. In 1893, Freud and his Viennese mentor, Joseph Breuer, cited both Charcot and Genet in a brilliant paper on the cause of hysteria. Hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscence. They proclaim and go on to note that these memories are not subject to the wearing away process of normal memories, but persist for a long time with astonishing freshness. Nor can traumatized people control when they will emerge. We must mention another remarkable fact, namely that these memories, unlike other memories of their past lives, are not at the patient's disposal. On the contrary, these experiences are completely absent from the patient's memory when they are in normal psychical state, or are only present in a highly summary form. All italics in the quote, okay, this is just, if you're looking at the actual book, it says, all italics in the quoted passages are Breuer's and Freud's. Brewer and Freud believed that traumatic memories were lost to ordinary consciousness, either because, quote, circumstances made a reaction impossible, end quote, or because they were, quote, severely paralyzing effects, such as fright, end quote. In 1896, Freud boldly claimed that the, quote, the ultimate cause of hysteria is always the seduction of the child by an adult, end quote. Then, faced with his own evidence of an epidemic of abuse in the best families of Vienna, one he noted that would implicate his own father, he quickly began to retreat. Psychoanalysis shifted to an emphasis on unconscious wishes and fantasies, though Freud occasionally kept acknowledging the reality of sexual abuse. After the horrors of World War I confronted him with the reality of combat neurosis, Freud reaffirmed that lack of verbal memory is central in trauma, and that if a person does not remember, he is likely to act out. He reproduces it not as a memory, but as an action. He repeats it without knowing, of course, that he is repeating, and in the end, we understand that this is his way of remembering. The lasting legacy of Brewer and Freud's 1893 paper is what we now call the talking cure. We found to our great surprise at first that each individual hysterical symptom immediately and permanently disappeared when we had succeeded in bringing clearly to light the memory of the event by which it was provoked and in arousing its accompanying effect. And when the patient had described that event in the greatest possible detail and had put the effect into words, period. Sorry, that the way I read that was a little confusing. Anyway, recollection without effect almost invariably produces no result. They explain that unless there is an energetic reaction to the traumatic event, the effect remains unattached to the memory and cannot be discharged. The reaction can be discharged by an action, from tears to acts of revenge, but language serves as a substitute for action. By its help, an effect can be abreacted almost as effectively. It will now be understood. They conclude how, okay, let me start that over. It will now be understood, they conclude, how it is that the psychotherapeutic procedure which we have described in these pages has a curative effect. It brings to an end the operative force which was not abreacted in the first instance, i.e., at the time of the trauma, by allowing its strangulated effect to find a way out through speech, and it subjects it to associative correction by introducing it into normal consciousness. Oh my gosh, the way that they're talking, I'm like, can we just say what we're trying to say? Anyway, okay, moving on. Even though psychoanalysis is today in eclipse, the talking cure has lived on, and psychologists have generally assumed that telling the trauma story in detail will help people to leave it behind. That is also a basic premise of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which today is taught in graduate psychology courses around the world. Although the diagnostic labels have changed, we continue to see patients similar to those described by Charcot, Genet, and Freud. In 1986, my colleagues and I wrote up the case of a woman who had been a cigarette girl at Boston's Coconut Grove nightclub when it burned down in 1942. During the 1970s and 1980s, she annually reenacted her escape on Newbury Street, a few blocks from the original location, which resulted in her being hospitalized with diagnoses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. In 1989, I reported on a Vietnam veteran who yearly staged an armed robbery on the exact anniversary of a buddy's death. He would put a finger in his pants pocket, claim that it was a pistol, and tell a shopkeeper to empty his cash register, giving him plenty of time to alert the police. This unconscious attempt to commit suicide by cop came to an end after a judge referred the veteran to me for treatment. Once he had dealt with his guilt about his friend's death, there were no further reenactments. Such incidences raise a critical question. How can doctors, police officers, or social workers recognize that someone is suffering from traumatic stress as long as he reacts rather than remembers? How can patients themselves identify the source of their behavior? If their history is not known, they are likely to be labeled as crazy or punished as criminals rather than helped to integrate the past. And we are on to a new section. This is the last section in the chapter called Traumatic Memory on page 183, Traumatic Memory on Trial. At least 24 men had claimed that they were molested by Paul Shanley, and many of them reached civil settlements with the Boston Archdiocese. Julian was the only victim who was called to testify in Shanley's trial. In February 2005, the former priest was found guilty on 2 counts of raping a child and 2 counts of assault and battery on a child. He was sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison. That's it. In 2007, Shanley's attorney, Robert F. Shaw Jr., filed a motion for a new trial, challenging Shanley's conviction as a miscarriage of justice. Shanley tried to make the case that repressed memories were not generally accepted in the scientific community, that the convictions were based on junk science, and that there had been insufficient testimony about the scientific status of repressed memories before the trial. The appeal was rejected by the original trial judge, but 2 years later was taken up by the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts. Almost 100 leading psychiatrists and psychologists from around the United States and 8 foreign countries signed an amicus curiae brief stating that repressed memory has never been shown to exist and that it should not be admitted as evidence. However, on January 10, 2010, the court unanimously upheld Shanley's conviction with his statement. In sum, the judge's finding that the lack of scientific testing did not make unreliable the theory that an individual may experience dissociative amnesia was supported in the record. There was no abuse of discretion in the admission of expert testimony on the subject of dissociative amnesia. In the following chapter, I'll talk more about memory and forgetting and about how the debate over repressed memory, which started with Freud, continues to be played out today. That is the end of chapter 11. We're going on to chapter 12 on page 184. You all, if you are liking this book so far, please remember to like the video and share any comments you might have on this topic, or whatever you feel like sharing. And I'm going to continue anyway. Oh yeah, if you are not subscribed, please subscribe. Okay, chapter 12 is called The Unbearable Heaviness of Remembering. It starts with a quote by Katie Cannon. Our bodies are the texts that carry the memories, and therefore remembering is no less than reincarnation. Scientific interest in trauma has fluctuated wildly during the past 150 years. Charcot's death in 1893 and Freud's shift in emphasis to inner conflicts, defenses, and instincts at the root of mental suffering were just part of mainstream medicine's overall loss of interest in the subject. Psychoanalysis rapidly gained in popularity. In 1911, the Boston psychiatrist Morton Prince, who had studied with William James and Pierre Janet, complained that those interested in the effects of trauma were like clams swamped by the rising tide in Boston Harbor. The neglect lasted for only a few years, though, because the outbreak of World War in 1914 once again confronted medicine and psychology with hundreds of thousands of men with bizarre psychological symptoms, unexplained medical conditions, and memory loss. The new technology of motion pictures made it possible to film these soldiers, and today on YouTube we can observe their bizarre physical postures. Strange verbal utterances, terrified facial expressions, and tics. The physical embodied expression of trauma, a memory that is inscribed simultaneously in the mind and interior images and words, and on the body. Early in the war, the British created the diagnosis of shell shock, which entitled combat veterans to treatment and a disability pension. The alternative similar diagnosis was neurasthenia, for which they received neither treatment nor a pension. It was up to the orientation of the treating physician which diagnosis a soldier received. More than 1 million British soldiers served on the Western Front at any one time. In the first few hours of July 1st, 1916, alone, in the Battle of the Somme, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties, including 19,240 dead, the bloodiest day in its history. The historian John Keegan says of their commander, Field Marshal Douglas Haig, whose statue today dominates Whitehall in London, once the center of the British Empire, quote, in his public manner and private diaries, no concern for human suffering was or is discernible, end quote. At the Somme, quote, he had sent the flower of British youth to death or mutilation, end quote. As the war wore on, shell shock increasingly compromised the efficiency of the fighting forces. Caught between taking the suffering of their soldiers seriously and pursuing victory over the Germans, the British General Staff issued General Routine Order number 2384 in June of 1917, which stated, in no circumstances whatever will the expression shell shock be used verbally or be recorded in any regimental or other casualty report or any hospital or other medical document. All soldiers with psychiatric problems were to be given a single dose of NYDN, or not yet diagnosed nervous. In November 1917, the General Staff denied Charles Samuel Myers, who ran 4 field hospitals for wounded soldiers, permission to submit a paper on shell shock to the British Medical Journal. The Germans were even more punitive and treated shell shock as a character defect, which they managed with a variety of painful treatments, including electroshock. In 1922, the British government issued the Southborough Report, whose goal was to prevent the diagnosis of shell shock in any future wars and to undermine any more claims for compensation. It suggested the elimination of shell shock from all official nomenclature and insisted that these cases should be no more classified as a battle casualty than sickness or disease is so regarded. The official view was that well-trained troops, properly led, would not suffer from shell shock, and that the servicemen who had succumbed to the disorder were undisciplined and unwilling soldiers. While the political storm about the legitimacy of shell shock continued to rage for several more years, reports on how to best treat these cases disappeared from the scientific literature. In the United States, the fate of veterans who were fraught with problems. In the United States, the fate of veterans was also fraught with problems. In 1918, when they returned home from the battlefields of France and Flanders, they had been welcomed as national heroes, just as the soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan today. In 1924, Congress voted to award them the bonus of $1.25 each day they had served overseas, but disbursement was postponed until 1945. By 1932, the nation was in the middle of the Great Depression, and in May of that year, about 15,000 unemployed and penniless veterans camped on the Mall of Washington, D.C. to petition for immediate payment of their bonuses. The Senate defeated the bill to move up disbursement by a vote of 62 to 18. A month later, President Hoover ordered the Army to clear out the veterans' encampment. Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur commanded the troops supported by 6 tanks. Major Dwight D. Eisenhower was a liaison with the Washington police, and Major George Patton was in charge of the cavalry. Soldiers with fixed bayonets charged, hurling tear gas into the crowd of veterans. The next morning, the mall was deserted and the camp was in flames. The veterans never received their pensions. While politics and medicine turned their backs on the returning soldiers, the horrors of the war were memorialized in literature and art, and all quiet on the Western Front. A novel about the war experiences of frontline soldiers by the German writer Erich Maria Remarque. The book's protagonist, Paul Ballmer, spoke for an entire generation, quote, I am aware that I, without realizing it, have lost my feelings. I don't belong here anymore. I live in an alien world. I prefer to be left alone, not disturbed by anybody. They talk too much. I can't relate to them. They are only busy with superficial things, end quote. Published in 1929, the novel instantly became an international bestseller with translations in 25 languages. In 1930, the 1930 Hollywood film version won the Academy Award for Best Picture. But when Hitler came to power a few years later, All Quiet on the Western Front was one of the first degenerate books the Nazis burned in the public square in front of the Humboldt University in Berlin. Apparently, awareness of the devastating effects of war on soldiers' minds would have constituted a threat to the Nazis' plunge into another round of insanity. Denial of the consequences of trauma can wreak havoc on the social fabric of society. The refusal to face the damage caused by the war and the intolerance of weakness played an important role in the rise of fascism and militarism around the world in the 1930s. The extortionate war reparations of the Treaty of Versailles further humiliated an already disgraced Germany. German society, in turn, dealt ruthlessly with its own traumatized war veterans who were treated as inferior creatures. This cascade of humiliations of the powerless set the stage for the ultimate debasement of human rights under the Nazi regime, the moral justification for the strong to vanquish the inferior, the rationale for the ensuing war. And next section is called The New Face of Trauma. The outbreak of World War II prompted Charles Samuel Myers and the American psychiatrist Abram Gardiner to publish the accounts of their work with World War I soldiers and veterans, shell shock in France, 1914 to 1918, in 1940, and the traumatic neuroses of war in 1941, served as the principal guides for psychiatrists who were treating soldiers in the new conflict, who guides for psychiatrists were treating soldiers in sorry you all. Okay. The traumatic neuroses of war in 1941 served as the principal guides for psychiatrists who were treating soldiers in the new conflict who had war neuroses. My bad, you all. The U.S. war effort was prodigious, and the advances in frontline psychiatry reflected that commitment. Again, YouTube offers a direct window into the past. Hollywood director John Huston's documentary, Let There Be Light, from 1946, shows the predominant treatment for war neuroses at that time, hypnosis. In Huston's film, made while he was serving in the Army Signal Corps, the doctors are still patriarchal and the patients are still terrified young men, but they manifest their trauma differently. While the World War I soldiers flare, have facial tics, and collapse with paralyzed bodies, the following generation talks and cringes. Their bodies still keep the score. Their stomachs are upset, their hearts race, and they're overwhelmed with panic. But the trauma did not just affect their bodies. The trance state induced by hypnosis allowed them to find words for the things that they had been too afraid to remember. Their terror, their survivor's guilt, and their conflicting loyalties. It also stuck with me that these soldiers seemed to keep a much tighter lid on their anger and hostility than the younger veterans I'd worked with. Culture shapes the expression of traumatic stress. The feminist theorist Germaine Greer wrote about the treatment of her father's PTSD after World War II. When the medical officers examined men exhibiting severe disturbances, they almost invariably found the root cause in pre-war experience. The sick men were not first-grade fighting material. The military proposition is that it is not war that makes men sick, but that sick men cannot fight wars. It seems unlikely the doctors did not father any good. The doctors did her father any It seems unlikely the doctors did her father any good, but Greer's efforts to come to grips with his suffering undoubtedly helped fuel her exploration of sexual domination and all its ugly manifestations of rape, incest, and domestic violence. When I worked at the VA, I was puzzled that the vast majority of the patients we saw on the psychiatry service were young, recently discharged Vietnam veterans, while the corridors and elevators that led to the medical departments were filled by older men. Curious about this disparity, I conducted a survey of the World War II veterans in the medical clinics in 1983. The vast majority of them scored positive for PTSD on the rating scales that I had administered, but their treatment focused on medical rather than psychiatric complaints. These vets communicated their distress via stomach cramps and chest pains rather than with nightmares and rage, from which my research showed they also suffered. Doctors shape how their patients communicate their distress. When a patient complains about terrifying nightmares and his doctor orders a chest ray, the patient realizes that he'll get better care if he focuses on his physical symptoms. Like my relatives who fought in or were captured during World War II, most of these men were extremely reluctant to share their experiences. My sense was that neither the doctors nor their patients wanted to revisit the war. However, military and civilian leaders came away from World War II with important lessons that the previous generation had failed to grasp. After the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, the United States helped rebuild Europe by means of the Marshall Plan, which formed the economic foundation of the next 50 years of relative peace. At home, the GI Bill provided millions of veterans with educations and home mortgages, which promoted general economic well-being and created a broad-based, well-educated middle class. The armed forces led the nation in racial integration and opportunity. The Veterans Administration built facilities nationwide to help combat veterans with their health care. Still, with all this thoughtful attention to the returning veterans, the psychological scars of war went unrecognized, and traumatic neuroses disappeared entirely from official psychiatric nomenclature. The last scientific writing on combat trauma after World War II appeared in 1947. All right, we are on to the next section. This is called Trauma Rediscovered. As I noted earlier, when I started to work with Vietnam veterans, there was not a single book on war trauma in the library of the VA. But the Vietnam War inspired numerous studies, the formation of scholarly organizations, and the inclusion of trauma diagnosis PTSD in the professional literature. At the same time, interest in trauma was exploding in the general public. In 1974, Friedman and Kaplan's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry stated that, quote, incest is extremely rare and does not occur in more than 1 out of 1.1 million people. As, end quote. As we've seen in Chapter 2, this authoritative text then went on to extol the possible benefits of incest. Quote, such incestuous activity demonstrates the subject's chance of psychosis and allows for a better adjustment to the external world. The vast majority of them were none the worse for the experience. How misguided those statements were became obvious when the ascendant feminist movement, combined with awareness of trauma and returning combat veterans, emboldened tens of thousands of survivors of childhood sexual abuse, domestic abuse, and rape to come forward. Consciousness-raising groups and survivor groups were formed, and numerous popular books, including The Courage to Heal, 1988, a best-selling self-help book for survivors of incest, and Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery, 1992, discuss the stages of treatment and recovery in great detail. Cautioned by history, I began to wonder if we were headed toward another backlash like those of 1895, 1917, and 1947 against acknowledging the reality of trauma. That proved to be the case, for by the early 1990s, articles had started to appear in many leading newspapers and magazines in the United States and in Europe about a so-called false memory syndrome, in which psychiatric patients supposedly manufactured elaborate false memories of sexual abuse, which they then claimed had lain dormant for many years before being recovered. What was striking about these articles was the certainty with which they stated that there was no evidence that people remember trauma any differently than they do ordinary events. I vividly recall a phone call from a well-known news weekly in London telling me that they had planned to publish an article about traumatic memory in their next issue and asking me whether I had any comments on the subject. I was quite enthusiastic about their question and told them that memory loss for traumatic events had been studied in England well over a century earlier. I mentioned John Erickson and Frederick Meyer's work on railway accidents in the 1860s and 1870s, and Charles Samuels Myers and W.H.R. Rivers's extensive studies on memory problems in combat soldiers of World War I. I also suggested they look at an article published in The Lancet in 1944, which described the aftermath of the rescue of the entire British Army from the beaches of Dunkirk in 1940. More than 10% of the soldiers who were studied had suffered from major memory loss after the evacuation. The following week, the magazine told its readers that there was no evidence whatsoever that people sometimes lose some or all of their memory for traumatic events. The issue of delayed recall in trauma was not particularly controversial when Myers and Gardner first described this phenomenon in their books on combat neurosis in World War I, when major memory loss was observed after the evacuation of Dunkirk, or when I wrote about Vietnam veterans and the survivor of the Coconut Grove nightclub fire. However, during the 1980s and early 1990s, as similar memory problems began to be documented in women and children in the context of domestic abuse, the efforts of abuse victims to seek justice against their alleged perpetrators moved the issue from science into politics and law. This in turn became the context for the pedophile scandals in the Catholic Church, in which memory experts were pitted against one another in courtrooms across the United States and later in Europe and Australia. Experts testifying on behalf of the church claimed that memories of childhood sexual abuse were unreliable at best, and that the claims being made by alleged victims were likely resulted from false memories implanted in their minds by therapists who were oversympathetic, credulous, or even driven by their own agenda. During this period, I examined more than 50 adults who, like Jillian, remembered having been abused by priests. Their claims were denied in about half the cases. Wow. All right, next section. This is on page 190. It's called The Science of Repressed Memory. There have in fact been hundreds of scientific publications spanning well over a century documenting how memory of trauma can be repressed only to resurface years or decades later. Memory loss has been reported in people who have experienced natural disasters, accidents, trauma, kidnapping, torture, concentration camps, and physical and sexual abuse. Total memory loss is most common in childhood sexual abuse, with incidents ranging from 19% to 38%. This issue is not particularly controversial. As early as 1980, the DSM-3 recognized the existence of memory loss for traumatic events in the diagnostic criteria for dissociative amnesia. Quote, an inability to recall important personal information, usually of a traumatic or stressful nature, that is too extensive to be explained by normal forgetfulness, end quote. Memory loss has been part of the criteria for PTSD since the diagnosis was first introduced. One of the most important studies of repressed memory was conducted by Dr. Linda Meyer Williams, which began when she was a graduate student in sociology at the University of Pennsylvania in the early 1970s. Williams interviewed 206 girls between the ages of 10 and 12 who had been admitted to a hospital emergency room following sexual abuse. Their laboratory tests, as well as the interviews with the children and their parents, were kept in the hospital's medical records. 17 years later, Williams was able to track down 136 of the children, now adults, with whom she conducted extensive follow-up interviews. More than a third of the women, 38%, did not recall the abuse that was documented in their medical records, while only 15 women, 12%, said they had never been abused as children. More than two-thirds, 68%, reported their other incidents of childhood sexual abuse. Women who were younger at the time of the incident and those who were molested by someone they knew were more likely to have forgotten their abuse. This study also examined the reliability of recovered memories. 1 in 10 women, 16% of those who recall the abuse, reported that they had forgotten it at some time in the past, but later remembered it had happened. In comparison with the woman who had always remembered the molestation, those with a prior period of forgetting were younger at the time of their abuse and were less likely to have received support from their mothers. Williams, who determined that the recovered memories were approximately as accurate as those that had never been lost. All the women's memories were accurate for the central facts of the incident, but none of their stories precisely matched every detail documented in their charts. Williams' findings were supported by recent neuroscience research that showed that memories that were retrieved tend to return to the memory bank with modifications. As long as a memory is accessible, the mind is unable to change it. But as soon as a story starts being told, particularly if it is told repeatedly, it changes. The act of telling itself changes the tale. The mind cannot help but make meaning out of what it knows, and the meaning we make of our lives changes how and what we remember. Given the wealth of evidence that trauma can be forgotten and resurface years later, why did nearly 100 reputable memory scientists from several different countries throw the weight of their reputations behind the appeal to overturn Father Shanley's conviction, claiming that, quote, repressed memories were based on junk science, end quote, because memory loss and delayed recall of traumatic experiences had never been documented in the laboratory? Some cognitive scientists adamantly denied that these phenomena existed, or that retrieved traumatic memories could be accurate. However, what doctors encounter in emergency rooms, on psychiatric wards, and on the battlefield is necessarily quite different from what scientists observe in their safe and well-organized laboratories. Consider what is known as the Lost in the Mall experiment, for example. Academic researchers have shown that it is relatively easy to implant memories of events that never took place, such as having been lost in a shopping mall as a child. About 25% of subjects in these studies later recall that they were frightened and even fill in missing details, but such recollections involve none of the visceral terror that a lost child would actually experience. Another line of research documented the unreliability of eyewitness testimony. Subjects might be shown a video of a car driving down a street and asked afterward if they saw a stop sign or a traffic light. Children might be asked to recall what a male visitor to their classroom had been wearing. Other eyewitness experiments demonstrated that the questions witnesses were asked could alter what they claimed to remember. These studies were valuable in bringing many police and courtroom practices into question, but they have little relevance to traumatic memory. The fundamental problem is this: events that take place in a laboratory cannot be considered equivalent to the conditions under which traumatic memories are created. The terror and helplessness associated with PTSD simply cannot be induced de novo in such a setting. We can study the effects of existing traumas in the lab, as in our script-driven imaging studies of flashbacks, but the original imprint of trauma cannot be laid down there. Dr. Roger Pittman conducted a study at Harvard in which he showed college students a film called Faces of Death, which contained newsreel footage of violent deaths and executions. This movie, now widely banned, is as extreme as any institutional review board would allow, but it did not cause Pittman's normal volunteers to develop symptoms of PTSD. If you want to study traumatic memory, you have to study the memories of people who have actually been traumatized. Interestingly, once the experiment and profitability of courtroom testimony diminished, the scientific controversy disappeared as well, and clinicians were left to deal with the wreckage of traumatic memory. Next section, called Normal versus Traumatic Memory. In 1994, I and my colleagues at Massachusetts General Hospital decided to undertake a systematic study comparing how people recall benign experiences and horrific ones. We placed advertisements in local newspapers, in laundromats, and on student union bulletin boards that said, "Has something terrible happened to you that you cannot get out of your mind? Call 727-5500. We will pay you $10 for participating in this study. In response to our first ad, 76 volunteers showed up. After we introduced ourselves, we started off by asking each participant, can you tell us about an event in your life that you think you will always remember, but that is not traumatic? One participant lit up and said, the day that my daughter was born. Other members mentioned their wedding day, playing on a winning sports team, or being valedictorian at their high school graduation. Then we asked them to focus on specific sensory details of those events, such as, are you ever somewhere and suddenly have a vivid image of what your husband looked like on your wedding day? The answers were always negative. How about what your husband's body felt like on your wedding night? We got some odd looks on that one. We continued, do you ever have a vivid, precise recollection of your speech that you gave as a valedictorian? Do you ever have intense sensations recalling the birth of your first child? The replies were all negative. Then we asked about the traumas that had brought them into the study, many of them rapes. Do you ever suddenly remember how your rapist smelled? We asked. And do you ever experience the same physical sensations you had when you were raped? Some questions precipitated powerful emotional responses. That is why I cannot go to parties anymore, because the smell of alcohol in somebody's breath makes me feel like I'm being raped all over again. Or I can no longer make love to my husband because when he touches me in a particular way, I feel like I'm being raped again. There were two major differences between how people talked about memories of positive versus traumatic experiences. One, how the memories were organized, and two, their physical reactions to them. Weddings, births, and graduations were recalled as events from the past, stories with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Nobody said that there were periods when they'd completely forgotten any of these events. In contrast, the traumatic memories were disorganized. Other subjects remembered some details all too clearly, the smell of the rapist, the gash in the forehead of a dead child, but could not recall the sequence of events or other vital details. The first person who arrived to help, whether an ambulance or a police car, took them to the hospital. Sorry. We also asked the participants how they recalled their trauma at 3 points in time: right after it happened, when they were most troubled by their symptoms, and during the week before the study. All of our traumatized patients said that they had not been able to tell anybody precisely what had happened immediately following the event. This will not surprise anyone who has worked in an emergency room or ambulance service. People brought in after a car accident in which a child or a friend has been killed sit in stunned silence, dumbfounded by terror. Almost all had reported flashbacks. They felt overwhelmed by images, sounds, sensations, and emotions. As time went on, even more sensory details and feelings were activated, but most participants also started to be able to make some sense out of them. They began to know what happened and to be able to tell the story to other people, a story that we call the memory of the trauma. Gradually, the images and flashbacks decreased in frequency, but the greatest improvement was in the participants' ability to piece together the details and sequence of the event. By the time of our study, 85% of them were able to tell a coherent story with a beginning, middle, and an end. Only a few were missing significant details. We noted that the 5 who said they had been abused as children had the most fragmented narratives. Their memories still arrived as images, physical sensations, and intense emotions. In essence, our study confirmed the dual memory system that Genet and his colleagues at the Salpêtrière had described more than 100 years earlier. Traumatic memories are fundamentally different from the stories we tell about the past. They are dissociated. The different sensations that entered the brain at the time of the trauma are not properly assembled into a story, a piece of autobiography. Perhaps the most important finding in our study was that remembering the trauma with all its associated effects does not, as Brewer and Freud claimed back in 1893, necessarily resolve it. Our research did not support the idea that language can substitute for action. Most of our study participants could tell a coherent story and almost experience the pain associated with the stories, but they kept being haunted by unbearable images and physical sensations. Research in contemporary exposure treatment, a staple of cognitive behavioral therapy, has similarly disappointing results. The majority of patients treated with that method continue to have serious PTSD symptoms 3 months after the end of treatment. As well as we will see, finding words to describe what has happened to you can be transformative, but it does not always abolish flashbacks or improve concentration, stimulate vital involvement in your life, or reduce hypersensitivity to disappointments and perceived injuries. This is our last section for today on page 194 called Listening to Survivors. Nobody wants to remember trauma. In that regard, society is no different from the victims themselves. We all want to live in a world that is safe, manageable, and predictable. The victims remind us that it is not always the case. In order to understand trauma, we have to overcome our natural reluctance to confront that reality and cultivate the courage to listen to the testimonies of survivors. In his book, Holocaust Testimonies, The Ruins of Memory, 1991, Lawrence Langer writes about his work in the Fortunoff Video Archive at Yale University. Listening to accounts of Holocaust experience, we unearth the mosaic of evidence that constantly vanishes into bottomless layers of incompletion. We wrestle with the beginnings of a permanently unfinished tale, full of incomplete intervals, faced by the spectacle of a faltering witness, often reduced to a distressed silence by the overwhelming solicitations of deep memory. As one of his witnesses says, if you were not there, it's difficult to describe and say how it was. How men function under stress is one thing, and then how you communicate and express that to somebody who never knew that such a degree of brutality exists seems like a fantasy. Another survivor, Charlotte Delbo, describes her dual existence after Auschwitz. The self who was in the camp isn't me, isn't the person who is here opposite you. No, it's too unbelievable. And everything that happened to this self, the one from Auschwitz, doesn't touch me now. Me doesn't concern me. So distinct are deep memory and common memory. Without this split, I wouldn't have been able to come back to life. She comments that even words have a dual meaning. Otherwise, someone in the camps who has been tormented by thirst for weeks and would never again be able to say, I'm thirsty, let's make a cup of tea. Thirst after the war has once more become a currently used term. On the other hand, if I dream I have the thirst I felt in Birkenau, the extermination facilities of Auschwitz, I see myself as I was then, haggard, bereft of reason, and tottering. Langer hauntingly concludes, who can find a proper grave for such damaged mosaics of the mind, where they may rest in pieces? Life goes on, but in two temporal directions at once, the future unable to escape the grip of a memory laden with grief. The essence of trauma is that it is overwhelming, unbelievable, and unbearable. Each patient demands that we suspend our sense of what is normal and accept that we are dealing with a dual reality, the reality of a relatively secure and predictable present that lives side by side with a ruinous, ever-present past. And that is the end of week 10 today, you all. Oh my gosh, that was weird, my lighting. Okay, so we are over halfway through this book. Share your comments if you have any, if you have experiences that you would like to share as well, please do that. And please remember to like and subscribe to the channel if you have not subscribed yet. Thank you all for being here. This is some pretty heavy content, and yeah, I'm really thankful that you're here still with me after 10 weeks. Yeah. It's heavy content, but it's really important information, I feel, for people to know, which is why I felt called to read this book for you all. So I love you all. You are sovereign, powerful, worthy, and loved. Please remember that, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.